Like to get started on time, 3 minutes late, but on time. That's always the plan, 2:03 Eastern time. So, everybody, welcome. Thank you very much for joining. Today, we're going to talk about transition risks and opportunities, what they are, what they mean, what you should do about them, and all of that. I'm going to share my screen here. So you should be able to see this. Just so folks know, there's a chat that is open. There's a Q&A that is open. So please chime in whenever you have any questions or thoughts that you'd like to add here. This is a bit of what we'll be talking about today. So quick introduction as to who we are, just what are transition risks and opportunities in general. Why do you need them? We'll give you a few examples of how different companies report on transition risks and opportunities. We'll talk about the process a consultant might go through with your company to actually assess these things. And then we'll discuss a little bit about how Beehive helps. The whole thing should be 30-35 minutes, plenty of time for questions if anyone has them. But we always like to get people out of here early. So let's get into it. Who are we? So my name is Adriel. I am the CEO of and founder of Beehive. Beehive is an enterprise climate risk management company. We help our customers measure and report on climate related financial risks and then also manage them with a few additional tools. So let's talk about what risks and opportunities actually are. So there's this lovely chart over here that you might see around the internet if you Google transition risks and opportunities. But this really comes from the original report from the TCFD. And the TCFD is Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, basically gives some guidance about what a transition risk and opportunity really is. And there's four categories of transition risks, and there's five categories of opportunities. We're going to ignore physical risks for the purposes of our conversation here. Um, the categories of transition risks are policy and legal, technology, market, and reputation. And the categories of opportunities are on the right over here: resource efficiency, energy source, products and services, markets, and resilience. So what's really wonderful about the TCFD framework, which was adopted by the IFRS S2, if you guys are wonks like I am, is that they give you a framework. They got to give you the rules. They give you the guidelines and the sandbox in which you can play. But then as you begin to unpack what risks and opportunities might exist for you, then you can either be fairly cookie cutter or you can get a little bit creative. So we talked about this already. The TCFD gives many examples of the type of risk or opportunity that might exist, and then what potential impacts of these things are. So just to give you one in each. So in policy and legal, some very common risks that you're going to find is that there's increased emissions reporting or just general climate regulation around the world, which might lead to things like increased operating costs because of higher compliance. You're going to see that a lot. In technology, you're going to see very often the risk of substitution of your products with better or call it lower emissions products as the markets change. Um, and that might create reduced demand. In market risk, you're really looking at changing customer behavior as really being a common thing. So I see, for example, there's a retailer on here, like a fashion clothing retailer. If consumer behavior is such that as young people care more and more about environmental risks, they're looking for more consignment thrift shops, and that might impact fast fashion or new fashion. That might create a market risk for you, again, causing reduced demand. And reputation, you actually find one a lot on here that's not written. Instead of shifts in consumer preferences, you might find like changing employee preferences. So you might find things like employees might not want to work for your business because they see you as a non-sustainable or sustainability friendly business. So that could create some risks there. Around opportunities, there are these five categories. So again, just to give you an example of each one of those, you might find an opportunity in using more efficient or move to more efficient buildings. You're going to find a lot, which could create reduced operating costs or improving that side of your business. And I'll give you a real live example of something like that fairly soon. I see we just had a couple folks join, so hello and welcome. We're just going over examples of transition risks and opportunities to sort of set the stage. And as a reminder, transition risk or an opportunity is basically asking you to evaluate what are your company's strengths and weaknesses as the global economy evolves due to climate change. Kind of leaves it necessarily fairly open, but it does give these guidelines of four categories of risks and five categories of opportunities you can consider. So just to keep going through one example of each, Around energy sources, you will often find something like using lower emissions sources of energy, again, reducing operational costs. Around products and services, a fairly common one is development of low emissions goods and services, and that creates increased revenue. So if you have a product and you're able to provide it more efficiently or at lower emissions or using less water, that might be more accepted by the market as it evolves due to climate. Markets, you often talk about access to new markets. This can be often markets, commercial markets. So maybe you're able to sell in countries or you're able to sell to governments that have requirements around sustainability, or even investment markets. So increased diversification of financial assets or like where you might get your money in. And then resilience is the last one. Actually, none on here are the ones I like, but you might hear a lot around we're able to bounce back faster after a disaster. Or their version of it here is like we have a stronger supply chain, so it makes us more resilient. So this kind of keeps on going. You see a lot of examples here, and I'll send everybody the link to this, but you can just Google TCFD guidance, and you'll find many of these examples of climate risks and opportunities. So let's find some real examples of what these things look like. So really quickly, just want to show you something brand new. You can go to beehiveclimate.com/TCFD library. This literally just launched yesterday, and you can see the TCFD reports of dozens of companies. We're going to improve a few things here, but if you want to see all software companies, you can filter it this way. Click on the company, and you're going to find their TCFD report. If you want to see reports that came out in 2024, you can do it this way. Click here, you'll see their TCFD report. So this can give you a really great way to just find examples of TCFD reports and find the risks that they talk about. So again, you can visit beehiveclimate.com/TCFD library to see all this. And this will have some improvements for the next couple of days. There's dozens in here. Um, dozens in here. Keeps on going. Uh, you could find your peers, whatever you want. So just to show you a couple examples of transition risks that people have reported on and opportunities that people have reported on. So this is US Steel, just to give one example. And in here, I'm going to zoom in so a little easier to see. They give multiple examples of policy risks that exist. And they talk about current regulation, they talk about emerging regulation, and then they talk about both the impact of this transition risk of these issues, and then what they're actually doing to mitigate it. This is fairly common. You'll find this sort of format of risk, impact, mitigation strategy in a lot of reports. It's not the only way to do it. I'll give you some other examples, but you're going to find something like that. So this policy risk that I actually told you earlier comes up a lot of. We have a risk of increased regulations and related to increased climate regulations that either create reputational damage if we don't comply or increased costs if we do comply. That is very common. And this is what they are doing about it. So you'll find many other risks here in US Steel. Obviously, risks are different per business. If you are a software business, you probably don't really care about shortages of raw materials and the increased costs. If you are a retailer, you might not care about the cost to scale low emissions technologies, just might not be as relevant. So you really need to assess which ones are relevant to you. But looking at peers and what other people have done could be an example of how you do that. And I'll give you some cool things that Beehive is doing about that in a moment. I like looking at Delta as well. US Steel, everyone's heard of, but no one actually has any idea what they do besides, I guess, make steel. But Delta, we can all connect with. So here's a few risks, transition risks that they have identified. They talk about something very specific to them, which is the uncertain future of jet fuel. Will this be available? Will this be permitted? Do they need to reconfigure their whole technology or their whole supply chain or think of new technologies in order to even have jet fuel? They talk about SAF availability as sort of the other side of that. SAF is sustainable aviation fuel. So instead of um, instead of traditional kind of fossil fuel driven jet fuel, actually, as they call it, fossil jet fuel, they might want SAF. But SAF also has uncertainties. Can they make it cheap enough? Can they make it good enough? And they talk about that. They do something slightly different in here that I actually like that US Steel does not do is you'll find the description of the risk and you'll find, of course, the risk mitigation strategy. But they also give you the time horizon and the impact, and they show you that purple is high impact, blue is medium impact, green is low impact. And they give you this little code for time horizons, some stuff short term, medium term, long term. Short, medium, long is very different for every business as well. For example, here you see short term. I think this came out in 2023. So short term is basically the next 2 years, medium term is the next 7 years, and long term is 13 years and beyond. Not many companies think on 13-year time horizons. Most probably consider long term to be 3 or 5 years and beyond. And short term to be this year, medium term to be like 1 to 3 years. But Delta, who has to build out, big facilities, work with airports, place an order for jets that are just designs, they think on long term horizons. So I like that they included that in here because just as a reminder, this is an investor disclosure. What you're trying to do is to say, we are trying to organize financially material information that a reasonable investor would want to see in order to make an investment decision. And how that investor looks at Delta is different than how they look at Asana or something like that, a different kind of company. And it's different than how they look at H&M, and it's different than how they look at US Steel. Although maybe there's some overlap. So you're trying to like standardize. You actually don't want to be terribly unique because you want to give investors some sort of apples to apples comparisons here. So I've seen some places where people get very creative with the risks that they have put in here. And I think that makes them feel good, but it's not necessarily a good thing here. This is not a impact report, storytelling, branding exercise. This is an investor disclosure, and you want to be as not creative in some ways as possible. You'll find here again, they mentioned this policy risk that we told you about. So policy risk is a risk of increased emerging regulations related to carbon emission that might cause and other regulations related to mitigate climate change that could cause issues for them. And they talk about the likelihood of that over whatever time horizon. For some of you on here, we have a product at Beehive that helps you manage or track global regulations. We're still building it out, so we're working with some pilot customers on that. But just some inside baseball here. That idea came from reading this risk in every single TCFD report. Everybody thinks that increased regulations related to environment or climate is going to be a burden for them. Everybody tracks global climate regulations in a giant spreadsheet, works with lawyers, consultants, kind of does it manually. So we're building an AI powered software to automate and improve on that. So still early, but if you're curious, I could show you more. Here's a final example. This is WTW. They're interesting, very different. They're actually a risk consulting firm, a fairly large one. But here it is again, policy and legal risks. So either pricing of these emissions or different kinds of laws show up for them. They're increasing climate related regulation. So these are very common. So one thing just to think about when you talk about risks, your general counsel, your CFO, your head of investor relations, head of legal, whatever, whoever's like the final stamp of approval on these things, they do not want to go outside the confines of what is normal. Nobody gets points for being extra transparent about the severity or the likelihood of a risk. So what they want to see is, okay, you've identified this as a risk. Who else does this? Like, why do you think this is a risk? Certainly, you can make the argument, oh, for my company, this is a risk for whatever reason. Like, am I going out on a limb here saying this? So that's where you want to be able to look at what your peers report and sort of benchmark yourself. I'll show you some stuff you can do about that in a moment. Those are examples. They actually talk a lot of policy and legal risks. And they talk about technology risks, and they finally mentioned demand for products and services being able to change because that affects what they're able to actually produce and prepare and how clients see them. So those are examples of risks. Let's talk about opportunities. And as we open this up, I just want to say again, feel free to put questions in the chat. There's also a Q&A if you want to be anonymous. Feel free to write that in throughout. I'm going to take a sip of my giant, this thing is the size of my daughter, Stanley Cup. Actually, fun aside, my daughter's new thing, she wakes up in the morning, she's 2 years old, she crawls into bed with Abby and I. She babbles, she wants to reread Llama Llama over and over again. But her main thing is she wants to drink out of somebody else's water bottle every morning. So sometimes it's mama's bottle, mama's bottle. And so the next morning we're like, all right, let's make sure mama's water bottle is nearby. But the next morning she wants papa's bottle, papa's bottle. So we bring both of those, but I don't know, we need Mila's bottle. It's got to be Mila's bottle. So it's very difficult to figure out whose bottle. We have like 7 water bottles around the room, so you guys don't care. So I just have to amuse myself. This is a lot of me talking. So opportunities. Let's look at the other side. So again, there's 5 categories of opportunities, and what you're trying to disclose here to investors that you are thinking about if the world has changed, if the global economy has changed due to climate, what, how can you take advantage of things to improve your business here? I was just at a conference yesterday, and someone had this guy who runs a big private equity fund has this amazing phrasing. He says, "This is the unavoidable opportunity." And his phrasing, I love this so much, I wrote it down. He said that we as an investment community, or even a business community, we know more about climate change over the next 10 to 20 years than we do about almost anything else. You can, with a fair amount of certainty, predict exactly what global temperatures will be, what emissions will be, how high risks will be in 2030. There's nothing we can do to change the trajectory through 2030. And there's very, very, very little. If tomorrow everyone switches to solar panels and becomes a vegan who never travels anywhere, we still can't really change 2040 very much. Our opportunity is much further along. So this guy, his name is Joy Ko, Koh, and his firm's called the Lightsmith Group. But what he said is that there's an unavoidable opportunity around climate because we are so confident in what's going to happen, it's unavoidable. How can you take advantage of these situations to help your customers, to help communities, to help cities adapt to these things? We know more about what's going to happen in global temperatures than we do what's going to happen to markets, than we do what's going to happen to consumer preferences, than we do what's going to happen to tariffs, than we do what's going to happen to will America have a 51st state? Then who will Democrats or Republicans win more elections over the next 10 to 20 years? All that is basically 50-50 or less. But climate, you sort of know what's going to happen. Now, I know there's some people who say we don't know, it's not yada, 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 but those people are probably not on this call. But you have a lot of confidence about what's going to happen. So, knowing that, what is the unavoidable opportunity that we can have here? And that's what investors are trying to understand. Are you aware of now all these things will play out? Maybe regulations don't come so fast, or maybe consumer preferences will change so fast, or maybe some terrible thing breaks out, another pandemic or whatever, something crazy happens, and everyone gets distracted and doesn't focus on climate, or they're focused on a bigger issue. All those are possible. But we know for a fact that climate's going to continue to get worse. So are you aware of the unavoidable opportunity? And I recommend everyone check out Joykoh. He was a really struck a chord with me. So here's a few examples of opportunities discussed in people's TCFD reports. So this is HubSpot, so like software, cloud-based software company, CRM. They talk about having a commitment to a green energy strategy, increasing their revenue because they have a better reputation from this work, and they meet the sustainability targets of their customers. That helps them attract and retain employees as another impact. So you see here a slightly different format. Again, they give a description, time horizon, likelihood of this happening, which actually I don't think Delta showed, and then the impact that this would have on their business. They also have the opportunity of increased accessibility to green transition capital. So this is investors actually valuing HubSpot a little bit higher than traditional cloud software companies because of all these things, which means they'd have a lower cost of capital. So you just think that they might be able to find. Here's a similar company. I want to show you GitLab. They're a smaller software company. A few billion in valuation. I think HubSpot's like 30 or 40. But some of the opportunities that they talk about, they just did a much simpler job. They said, what is the impact over what time horizon? Is it low, medium, or high? And so they just picked two. They said resilience. They have an opportunity to increase resilience in their supply chain through supplier engagement. I'll give you a quick example of this. And then increase market opportunities. Specifically, they might get more investment or revenue, like we talked about, because of the things that they do. And that seems moderate in the medium term, and then high in the long term. Big opportunity, basically, like you're saying, in the medium term, like we're already getting requests from investors or from customers to share this information with them. Can we win more business in the short term and medium term? In the long term, we are fairly confident it's going to become just a requirement. You're not even going to be able to work with somebody in whatever they call long term. Do they quantify the time frame? I'm not sure that they did. But there we go. So they're basically saying in 10 years, you won't even be able to like get a business license without measuring emissions, is their get. So it'll be very significant. One thing that's interesting here is that let's see if I can find this really quickly. TTFD. This is probably the wrong search. Oh yeah, there you go. Cool. So they talked about what they're doing around this in a different. This is the section where they describe what is the resilience of the organization. But they said that they have a supply chain analysis strategy because that's an opportunity for them, and they actually asked their suppliers around their TCFD disclosure, maturity, and quality. So that's an example of them saying we've identified this opportunity that we can be more resilient by having a resilient supply chain. And then later in the report, they say that, that opportunity I told you about earlier, here's what we're doing about that. And so they do a good job there. And the last one I want to share here is McDonald's. What's interesting, a couple things in their opportunity breakdown. Wait, these are risks, these are opportunities. So they basically divide this up and they did a lot of graphics here, which I think is pretty, but costs a lot of money. They said in the short term, here's the risks and opportunities. In the medium term, which they define as the next 10 years or so, and the long term, what are their opportunities? And sort of sections it out that way, which is not common. Usually people section it out first the transition risks, then the physical risks, then the opportunities, something like that. Um, Actually, often like physical risks, transition risks, then opportunities. But if you look at a couple interesting things here, in the short term, they're focused on transition to efficient buildings. In the medium term, they're focused on regenerative farming. And that's also a long-term opportunity that continues to grow because of the long-term issues. So they sort of divided it out with a few connective tissues. But also, just so you notice, what they don't have is like the likelihood that HubSpot had. They have the time horizon, they have the potential impact of it in a quick description that they sort of combined, but they don't have the severity of this either. That we think that this will have a high impact or a significant or a medium impact. So people do this in different ways. So those are a bunch of transition risks and opportunities. Now we can talk a little bit about how you actually do this work, how you actually run this assessment. Um, Again, feel free to chime in with any questions or anything like that in the chat or the Q&A. So, your traditional approach would be to work with a consultant. I have this lovely little slide here. Explains how I think consultants work. A lot of pretty charts, a lot of pretty graphs. But basically, the way a consultant does this, and I know this is a little bit trite, but the traditional process that a consultant goes through is they say, hey, we're going to do a transition risk assessment. The way we're going to do this is we're going to interview executives across the business, maybe run a few workshops with them, and we're going to ask them questions to really understand how they think their business might be changed due to climate. And so they'll go to your CMO and say, hey, how do you think the market's changing due to climate? They'll go to your head of engineering and they'll say, hey, do you think that you have, like, what risks do you think exist to your data centers? They'll go to your head of HR and say, hey, how do you think the recruiting market or employee engagement is going to change due to climate? What opportunities exist for you? And they'll basically ask all the executives that, and then they'll consolidate all that information together into your transition risk assessment and then, or opportunities as well, and then sort of present that back to you. I think there's strengths and weaknesses to that approach. The strengths are executive engagement, right? Like everyone here wants their C-suite to know what they're working on, and this is a really amazing place that you can do that if you hire consultants, be it a Big Four, PwC, or Deloitte, or a more boutique consultant, and they come up to your C-suite. It's really valuable. It's good face time for you. It's good appreciation of this important work, and it's also good for executives to start thinking about that. And then they get the end result of finding these risks and opportunities. And I think the negatives of this approach is that it's time consuming. So, the process I described, you got to schedule all these calls. It takes your executives hours of their real time to have these meetings, and you got to review it again at the end. But I think a more important, and I know I'm talking my book here and being a little bit trite, but there's sort of what I call uninformed executive engagement. So it's great that you're asking your executive questions. Think about your own CMO and what would she say or he say if they were asked, hey, in 10 years, how do you think climate will influence our business? Like, have they ever thought about that? Or if you go to your head of HR and you say, hey, what short, medium, long term opportunities exist for us when it comes to climate? Like, do they have, they're really smart, they're really capable, and they know HR or people management better than anyone, know your company really well. Like, are they experts on the climate thing? No. So I think while it informs the consultant, it's not necessarily the best use of that executive's time. What you want to do is keep that executive engagement because it's really valuable. And you want to keep the good part of identifying risks and opportunities, but you want to make the executive engagement more informed, meaning use their time better, and then reduce that time consuming process, both time consuming in terms of man hours. Like I need to run a 2 hour long interview with 10 executives, 20 man hours, but also in terms of months of the engagement. It takes a lot of time to schedule those things. And so that's what Beehive tries to do. So this is the Beehive software. What you're able to do in here is we know a lot about the business and we let AI run the initial risk assessment. So we take a bunch of documents that you might have given us, your impact reports, your 10Ks. We're able to scrape your website, find publicly available information. We train the AI to really understand your business. We don't give it anything proprietary. It's just the stuff that you gave us and what's publicly available, but it understands it better than any individual consultant ever could. We then teach it the rules of the TCFD, the guidelines. We feed it your peer reports. We feed it the giant database we have of risks and opportunities. And then it's able to say, hey, here's the transition risks we think apply to you. Here's the opportunities we think apply to you. And here's the time horizons under which they apply, the impacts, the likelihoods. So it's able to do all that. And then when I actually don't think I have this set up, which is my fault here. But when it cites a source, it cites it in here and says, this is why we think it is what it is. The process then goes, the AI takes a look at it. Then our team looks at it and is like, yeah, did it say anything silly? Did it make a mistake? And then we'll go to the client, the individual user, this is often maybe like a director level person who's like doing the work here and say, hey, let's review this together. Does it make sense? And maybe have some different opinions. Maybe what we thought was a short-term risk is actually a medium-term risk. Maybe we thought was medium impact. You're like, oh, you don't know my business. We actually have high impact, whatever. So we do that initial review. So we took care of that long time commitment, again, time horizon and people hours situation. Great, check the box. AI made it really fast. This is all done in 10 minutes. Um, but now we still need to care of the executive engagement. Because if you want that, not all companies do. Some just want to like move right along here. But if you want the executive engagement, you should get it. That's a really important part of this. But you don't want the uninformed executive engagement. So now what you're able to do is say, hey, I've identified a couple of policy risks, and I want to see the ones that have high risks. Yeah, this maybe not necessary if you have only three things here, but now you can go to your general counsel and instead of saying, "Hey, GC, what risks do you think exist due to climate change?" I'll be like, I don't know. I'll give you some stuff, but I'm not really sure. I haven't thought about it. You can say, "Hey, we've identified these three risks, and this is some sourcing about why we think these are risks. Let's have a conversation about what we're going to do about that. If anything, are we gonna act on it? Are we gonna address it? Or are we gonna ignore it and say we got other things going on?" Which is a totally fine answer as long as you're ignoring it in an informed capacity. You can then go to your marketing person and say, hey, I've identified this risk and I think it's going to create a medium impact for us in the short term. Do we want to address it? Here's what it means. Here's how this looks. Here's some stuff that our peers have said, right? Oops, wrong one here. You can come in here and say, oh, I found all the technology companies who have published stuff recently. Here's why they have said something like this. And you can have that informed conversation with the user. So that's the way this process works inside of Beehive. We basically try to say, what is the good part of consulting, which is you get the end result that you can report in your TCFD report, which you have to do for SB 261 in California, and you get the executive engagement, but you remove the uninformed part and you make it all much faster. There's something cool coming. I just wanted to show you a design, like a mock-up of what this will look like fairly soon. What we're going to be able to do is the AI will automatically pull quotes from the disclosures of your peers and say, here's an example of your peer that said this thing. So right now, what this looks like is, hey, we've identified that this is a risk. And then you might go on your own and say, oh, well, which are my peers? What do they say? Again, you do this in other parts of the app a little more natively as well. But what you'll be able to do fairly soon is say, and here's two peers of mine and specifically what they wrote on what page. So it saves you the trouble of needing to go like find it in your own peers reports and read through all their risks. So that'll be really cool. We'll also show you the evidence for the assessment. So maybe it'll pull out something from a research paper. Maybe it'll pull out something from your 10K. Maybe it'll pull out something from a blog you published about your marketing strategy, and it'll say, we found this source. So then you can really understand, why did you think what you thought? Again, the goal here is to say, let's have that informed conversation as quickly as possible. And this provides some of that informed conversation. You also see how peers have responded to this in terms of impact, likelihood, and time horizon, if they have. So that is some of what's coming. The one that's coming first, probably in like 3 weeks or so, is this feature where we'll show you what a peer said, and you'll be able to pull that comparison really quickly with these coming over the next couple of months. So that was a lot. We talked a little bit about what transition risks and opportunities are, how they come up, a bunch of examples of each, pulled from real reports, the consulting process, which again, there's many good things too, but you want to make sure you're optimizing for your time well and informed conversations, and a bit of how Beehive helps today, and what's coming down the pipeline. And you learned a little bit about my daughter and her drinking habits. So I call that productive 35 minutes. I'll pause here for a minute. I will sit quietly. If anyone has any questions, wants to dive deeper into anything, uh, wants to learn about my daughter, probably can keep your questions to transition risks, but I'm happy to share. Let me know. Feel free to throw it into the chat or the Q&A. I'll just sit quietly for a minute. Okay. Someone's bringing this up internally. I love it. Um, That'll be good. I won't mention the person's name here, but they're bringing it up to their internal audit team. I think what's really interesting about audit is they want credibility. They want to know where this is coming from. So I think that sourcing is really, really important, instead of just like, hey, we put on our thinking caps and smart people told us whatever. Sourcing is really important. Um, yeah, this person asked, would love more ideas on what to ask them about, how they're managing emerging risks today, and what they might be missing. Yeah, it's a really good question. So I'll keep the answer to transition risk. We won't touch on physical for a moment. My genuine opinion is that a lot of transition risks are a little bit fluffy. And this is not an opinion just out of nowhere. I've talked to some folks who work with some really big consultants that paid a lot of money, and it's a very qualitative process. There's some places in which you can quantify a transition risk. So, for example, that risk we showed multiple times of emerging regulations, creating compliance burdens. You can quantify that a little bit. You can say, what are all the regulations that exist today or bills that have been proposed? And if they all pass, what's our either compliance burden? Will it cost us 100,000, 500,000, $1 million to comply? What's the risk of non-compliance? Will we be fined $1 million, $10 million, whatever? So some stuff you can quantify, but some's really hard. How do you quantify the reputational risk of an employee joining or not joining you? It's really hard to quantify. So but those are the rules. You got to report these transition risks, which is why I think you want to make it fast and really source why you think what you think is. It's really a strategic conversation. So when you're talking to your audit team about how they're doing these things, about how they're tracking these risks today, I think understanding like how they thought at all about do they know the categories of transition risks? Have they thought about the opportunities of like how to make a lot more money? For example, um, if you guys have a program helping your customers either measure emissions or reduce emissions or convert to renewable energy or use improved products, like that is an opportunity that your investors should know about, and that story needs to be told, and that can be told. If they're quantifying a risk of some sort, like that regulatory risk I shared about, do they have this big spreadsheet where they're just like listing out all the regulations that exist in the world, and when some intern or somebody has time to get to it, they add to it? That's a really rough process, and they're going to drop the ball on that. So there's a lot of ways to improve these risks. Someone asked, within ERM, do you think it makes more sense to call out climate risks as a standalone topic with impacts across the organization, or go function by function and try to insert climate related risks into the definitions? Opportunities feels more mature, managing risks feels more immediate. That's a good question. So I think let me take that a step back. The goal here is not to keep climate as a separate issue. Climate should not be a thing special in any way. It shouldn't be special in the good way of, oh, our climate program's so amazing. And it shouldn't be special in a bad way. Oh, how dare you waste your money on a climate program? It should be integrated into how you look at all other risks in your ERM strategy. And if your ERM team weighs cybersecurity or geopolitical risk or governance risk or whatever as more material than climate risk, that's okay. It doesn't have like I like climate, but it doesn't have to be the most material thing to your business. But it should be considered in the same way that other risks are considered. And so it should be implemented into your ERM team. Now, what your ERM team will find is that some departments are more impacted than others by it, and they will bring it to that function. Just again, just like they do, they should not be a very different process here. Initially, it is, it's a young industry, but it should be brought into your ERM. So if your ERM team says, we've done an assessment on climate risks. And what we've identified is that the most material short-term risk is market risks that uh we might lose business if we don't have these things. Obviously, the team impacted by that is going to be your sales go-to-market team, not your revenue function. It's not going to be your security team. It's not going to be your supply chain team. It's going to be that team. If they've identified that your most material risks are the fact that your suppliers might increase their costs of products because of whatever, then your supply chain team needs to be the one that they go to that to. So I think this should be as integrated into your ERM process as possible. And then they should bring this to the proper function leaders and don't distract your executives just because you did a thing you want them to know about. Like bring to them if there's material. If you don't think it's a big deal that if you think you're gonna lose one deal a year because of climate stuff, don't bring it to your chief revenue officer. Like they're not worried about one deal a year. If you think that um none of your employees care about climate because or they care about climate like 10th after many other issues, don't bring it to your head of HR. It's not gonna create a big issue for them and you don't want to seem not credible. But if you've identified something that's actually material, that you're going to not have access to capital, it's in a significant way, that you're losing your most significant customers, that your regulatory compliance burden is above $5 million a year, and that's a threshold for materiality. Yeah, like make sure the proper executive knows about it for sure. And I think that's also the goal of Beehive is to say like this should be part of a process. You have cybersecurity software, you have supply chain software. Like you need a climate risk software, and then let it rise to the level of materiality where it does. Don't force the issue, and then bring the right team member onto the software to address these issues. So that's sort of how we think about it a little bit. Great questions. Thank you. Anyone else with a comment or a question? All right, beautiful. Well, thank you guys very much. We have some amazing. What we do this every single Thursday, 2 p.m. Eastern time. Next week, we're talking about climate risk governance. There's a couple in June that are going to be very, very popular. We're interviewing Dave Standris, the Chief Sustainability Officer of Apollo, the private equity fund. I think that's on June 19th and on the 26th. Or that's on June 12th. Sorry, on June 19th, we're interviewing Brendan Maloney, who runs sustainability at DocuSign. We have a couple others in between that are going to be wonderful. But thank you everybody for joining, and I hope to see you there. Bye.